Hey, this is Sandy.
And Randy.
And we're here on AT Corner.
Being an athletic trainer comes with ups and downs, and we're here to showcase it all.
Join us as we share our world in sports medicine.
Welcome back to another episode of AT Corner. For this episode, we are going back to the upper extremity. We don't have a lot of upper extremity ones.
No, we don't.
So today we are talking about the UCL, in particular the UCL in your throwing athletes.
Cool, I'm excited.
Yes, so our objectives for this episode are we're going to describe the relevant anatomy of the medial elbow. Now, last education episode, we jumped into physiology, but we're going back to anatomy for this one.
Dun, dun, dun.
You don't have to make it sound like that.
No, I'm actually excited for this anatomy.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I hope so. Well, and you can't really talk about the UCL without talking about anatomy, it seems like.
I mean, the UCL is a part of anatomy.
Valid. We'll also discuss the risk factors associated with UCL injury in the overhead athlete. And then we'll talk about implementing intervention programs to address risk factors associated with UCL injury.
And stay tuned at the end. We're going to be talking about the bonus content of this episode.
Absolutely. So, like we said, the anatomy. So, the UCL complex is made up of 3 different bundles. Anytime you talk about the UCL, the first thing you're going to talk about is the anterior bundle. And the reason for this is because it is the primary restraint to valgus force. Now, you can even subdivide the anterior bundle into 2 sections. You have an anterior band and the posterior band. For the anterior band, it was initially thought that, it's taut in extension, but there's been recent anatomical studies that show it's just tight throughout the elbow range of motion. So it's tight through extension and flexion. So the anterior band is pretty important for elbow stability.
I wanted to make a joke about the anterior band being tight, but I don't think I have one.
Good one.
No, that wasn't a joke. I literally don't have one.
So, obviously, the anterior band, we have to talk about the posterior band. And this one is pretty true to what was believed previously is as you go into more elbow flexion, the posterior band will become taut as well. So you can see in your overhead throwers, like your pitchers and stuff, right? Their arm is pretty much in 90 degrees of elbow flexion when they are releasing. Not all of them, but in the traditional over the top pitcher, you can kind of see that. So you can see both these bands of the anterior bundle are taut in this way. So you can see how it's already tightening up to prepare for that valgus stress in that fashion. So the anterior bundle itself actually inserts into what's called the sublime tubercle. And no, we're not talking about the band Sublime, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan. I like Sublime. They got some good jams.
I think I would remember learning about the sublime tubercle, but I think this is the first time I'm actually
That
learning
is
about
100% what I thought about when I was reading about this. I had no idea what we were talking about, so I had to look it up. And really the sublime tubercles, this little tubercle that's on the proximal end of the ulna. But as these anatomical studies have kind of looked more into the UCL itself, it's not just the UCL is not attaching to one spot. It actually spreads a little bit more distal from sublime tubercle into the ulnar ridge itself. Not super far, but a little bit. So that's going to be very important because there are certain muscles that attach around that same area.
Do they?
Yes, they do. So before we talk about your muscular support, we'll also just address the posterior and oblique, or sometimes called transverse bundles of the UCL. So these are the other 2 bundles that kind of make up the entire complex. And really the posterior band or the posterior bundle and the oblique and transverse bundles have limited contribution to throwing stability. So they're really not talked much about in the literature. But what I did find out was that transverse or oblique bundle, which most people think is pretty useless, does kind of attach to the anterior bundle, so maybe in the future we'll learn that maybe it has some stability role, but right now it's pretty limited on how those 2 bundles actually contribute to stability.
So for the most part, when we're talking about the UCL and overhead athletes, we're mostly talking about the anterior and posterior band?
Of the anterior bundle, yeah.
Okay.
So the anterior bundle is your bread and butter. That's what we're talking about. Anytime you think UCL, it's probably that. So we talked about the ligament itself, and in particular the anterior bundle, but now let's talk about the muscles that help support this ligament.
And this is going to be super important for rehab.
Yes, absolutely. So in general, you can group the muscles that support the UCL into what's called the flexor pronator mass. You probably have an idea what muscles these are just by the name of that mass right there.
If you touch your arm, they're probably pretty tender.
Especially after throwing.
And in your dominant hand.
Oh, 100%. And this group tends to be the flexor carpi ulnaris, the flexor digitorum superficialis, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, and we're going to throw the brachialis in there, and we'll discuss why that's getting thrown into this group as well. So why are these muscles important? Why do we even care when we're talking about UCL injuries about this musculature? And it's believed that all these muscles work together to enhance stability of the medial elbow against your valgus force. What's interesting is your average pitcher just throwing a ball produces more force than the actual UCL's failure rate.
Okay.
And so when you throw a ball, are people just tearing their UCLs after they throw the ball once really hard?
I hope not. Otherwise, we would not see any baseball.
No, baseball wouldn't be a thing if that was the case. So why is the UCL not tearing in something that's such a large force for the UCL? And the reason is because this whole muscle group has tendinous attachments to the medial capsule and actual portions of the UCL.
So basically, the UCL has a really good support group.
Oh, yes. It definitely has some groupies that are like there to give them support.
You would say they're tight?
Yes.
There's the joke.
I would say there we go. We found the joke in this. So if you look at the anatomy of how these muscles are, they're very close together and they're very intimate with the anterior bundle of the UCL. Like the flexor carpi ulnaris overlaps about 21% of the distal anterior bundle.
Wait, can you say that again? I need to process this.
Yes. So where the anterior bundle attaches on the ulna, the flexor carpi ulnaris overlaps that portion by 21%.
Okay, so basically the UCL is not the only thing in that area.
Nope. And that's why it's important when you say where it inserts not just the sublime tubercle, but actually on more of the ulna than it was originally thought.
What does?
The anterior bundle.
Got it.
Then the flexor digitorum superficialis attaches along. Now this is actually attaching to the UCL and attaches to about 45% of the anterior bundle's distal attachment. So it's almost like extending the UCL a little bit.
Nice.
Right?
Does that change like the lever?
I'm not sure. That's a good. I didn't think of it from like that kind of standpoint, like changing the lever arm. I guess it would.
To be continued.
Yeah, TBD. I'm sure someone's
more research is needed.
I'm sure someone. Yes, the favorite line of any research study: more research is needed. Pronator teres attaches to the distal attachment of the anterior bundle. So right on that extension from the sublime tubercle, pronator teres is attaching there. And the brachialis has attachments to the same tendinous septum. So all a tendinous septum is a giant tendon that is made up of other tendons. And it's the same septum as the pronator teres and flexor digitorum superficialis, which is also shared by flexor carpi ulnaris. So you can see how close all these muscles are to supporting the UCL and how interconnected they are.
So this flexor pronator mass is basically playing Twister on your ulna.
100%. 100%. So I know what everyone's thinking, especially Sandra, because she hates it when I get this in depth with anatomy is, what does this mean? Why is it even relevant?
No, I'm enjoying this.
Why is this even relevant at all? And like I was saying, these muscles work together to protect that medial elbow. When you look at studies that have looked at the different phases of throwing, the EMG levels of your wrist flexors have been shown to peak right around the acceleration phase for the overhead athlete and during the release phase for your softball pitchers, which around those times are when you're getting that peak valgus force. So you can kind of see the relationship of, I'm getting a lot of valgus force, but these muscles are also turning on a lot around that same time frame. So how do we know these muscles being activated even does anything? And I thought this was really interesting, looking at these studies that actually dove into what does these muscles contracting do. And in one study, they did a cued grip strength. So they put someone's arm in like a machine to recreate valgus. They did an ultrasound to measure joint space. And then during the valgus, they told someone to grip as hard as they can. And just doing gripping decreased that medial joint space when the valgus load was applied.
Okay, that alone, you don't need to... We're done with this episode. Grip strength protects UCL. All right.
And
bottom line,
what I thought was very interesting was like grip strength. That's kind of a general movement. They actually broke it down into the individual fingers of the flexor digitorum superficialis, and the index and the two middle fingers were able to decrease the joint space the most. So it's really highlighting how important just the flexor digitorum superficialis is.
Because that one does the two middle fingers.
And the index finger.
Really? That's not the...
No, it has...
Indices?
Well, indices does, but the flexor digitorum does as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Can we talk more about risk factors for UCL injury?
Yes, absolutely. So, and remember, these risk factors we're talking about mostly in overhead athletes, which means it's probably done in baseball players. I do have some stuff on softball players and other like volleyball and swimmers, but a lot of the research on this, fortunately and unfortunately, I guess, is on baseball players. So take that with a grain of salt with your other sports, your other upper body sports.
I mean, technically, we're talking about overhead athletes. So.
Exactly. So most of these studies have either looked at range of motion, demographics, or even their participation data. And in general, you can break it down into fatigue or increased workload has been shown to be a pretty strong risk factor for medial elbow injury.
What is fatigue not a risk factor for?
That is very true.
If you're tired, you're going to get injured.
Exactly. And I think that's really where a lot of our injury prevention stuff is starting to go, is monitoring training load and workload and how do we manage that. So how they broke, like when they say increased workload, how they broke it down was they found that fewer days between consecutive games / having a high pitch count per game increases your likelihood of getting a UCL injury or an elbow injury in general. Which kind of makes sense. If you're constantly being exposed to the thing that can hurt you a lot and you get more micro trauma, you're probably going to fail at some point. And what I thought was interesting is this is definitely supported in softball literature. Because I am now working softball, I have had to dive into the research because it's like I've never really worked softball before. So I wanted to learn, especially about the pitchers and like what makes them different than baseball pitchers. And I just wanted to learn about the sport. And what's very common with softball pitching is they don't manage their pitchers like they do in baseball. The old thought was like, oh, the windmill pitch is totally safer than overhead throwing. It is not, by the way. That's what I learned.
Okay, that's really interesting because I feel like you just read my mind. I was just thinking about the incidence of UCL in the windmill versus...
It's just a different mechanism by how things happen. I feel like softball, there's a lot of shoulder stuff than necessarily elbow. But to say that the windmill pitch is safer is not a correct statement. And the reason for this old thinking, it led to a lot of teams not having a lot of pitchers available. And if you're a good pitcher on a team, you're probably going to pitch almost the entire weekend.
Oh, I bet. I mean, I've seen some of our I've seen some of our softball players, our pitchers, go 2 games in a row without a relief because they that's not how they do it.
Yeah, 100%. And what's funny is in the softball literature, pitching consecutive days shows that there's a decrease in shoulder strength and an increase in shoulder pain. So those athletes are going out there pitching again with increased shoulder pain, which we've already talked about in season 1 in all the injury episodes, was how pain can change how your body functions and how the motor system processes things. And then also now you have a decrease in shoulder strength, which we can all agree, if the shoulder's not doing its job to protect the arm, other muscles are going to have to take over. That's where you start seeing an increase in stress on that elbow. Also, what they found was in just one bout of softball pitching, just one outing, there was increased fatigue of the wrist flexors and pronators.
Now, our protective group.
And if the protective group's tired, they're not protecting very well.
Nope. Bodyguards off duty.
Exactly. So I think that really highlights the importance of we really need to think about how often our athletes are pitching and take into account how they feel and what their fatigue level is, because that is going to be a big indicator of who's at risk of injury. Another interesting one that I thought that came up a lot in the baseball literature was demographic data. Playing in warmer climates led you to have a higher risk of UCL injury.
Why?
Because it goes back to the fatigue thing. You get increased exposure. If you're playing in somewhere that's warm all year round or has great weather, you can play baseball longer than someone who, like in the winter, they just don't really get to play baseball very often.
You can't throw indoors?
You could, but you're probably playing another sport at that point, which can be protective.
Hockey.
Yeah. Which you could get UCL injuries there, just not from overuse. It would be a more traumatic event. And then one that everyone likes to look at is range of motion. And the literature on this is surprisingly pretty mixed. So some studies show total range of motion deficit and GERD or glenohumeral internal rotation deficit to be risk factors, and some show that it might not be as strong of a risk factor as we might think. So there was a meta-analysis in pitchers that found that if the dominant arm was lacking 5 more degrees of external rotation than the non-dominant arm, they were more likely to be injured, which makes sense because one of the natural adaptations to throwing is you gain more shoulder external rotation. Well, if you're not getting that adaptation, you're trying to build velocity elsewhere, and again, could lead to more stress on the elbow. But in another review, they found that if the non-dominant arm had higher internal rotation than the dominant arm, then they were at a higher risk of getting an elbow injury, which is interesting because in that review, they didn't say anything about the dominant arm.
What do you mean?
Like the dominant arm range of motion did not matter in injury risk, but yet the non-dominant arm did.
So they were looking at the opposite side.
The review looked at both, but they found no differences if there were any changes in dominant arm range of motion, but in the non-dominant arm they did.
Huh.
Right? But it still shows that, like, if they're not symmetrical, I would say there's something wrong.
So basically, I mean, when you watch someone pitch, it's a full body effort.
Yes, absolutely.
So when we're looking at injury risk, we shouldn't just be looking at one targeted area. We should be looking more big picture.
Yes, absolutely. And I would also highlight that in any injury risk study that they're trying to find, or like any prospective studies like that, range of motion tends to be iffy in general. And the reason for this, and I know I've said it before, is we just look at these range of motion measures in one point in time and that's it. And then you just see like, okay, here are the measurements. Did this person get hurt at some point during the season? But no one is taking into account, how does load with someone who has poor range of motion, does that make a difference? Like if you have poor range of motion and pitch once and don't get hurt, does that mean that, oh, his range of motion did not predispose him? I would say no, because he only had a very low exposure. But if he pitches like 5 innings every game, I think you'll start to see that range of motion deficits become a stronger risk factor. Does that make sense?
I partially followed that.
I think we really need to just view these like, if someone has these range of motion deficits, we should really be monitoring that person's workload, because I feel like if they have a larger workload, they're being put at a greater risk of injury, and that's when range of motion can be that indicator.
So are you saying that range of motion is secondary to workload?
I think it can be. I think that's when you'll see that those range of motion deficits to be strong risk factors when someone's under a larger workload.
So if someone has a range of motion deficit, it's not necessarily, oh, your UCL is going to be gone if you play baseball or softball. But if you're at high workloads and you notice that someone has a range of motion deficit, then maybe we should be watching.
Yeah, exactly. So I wouldn't say your preseason range of motion testing is trash. I would say that's incorrect. I think it's very important to get an idea. And it can really highlight someone like, oh, their range of motion's a mess. Maybe they shouldn't be throwing 200 innings this year without some kind of intervention or proper management.
So they've got some work to do before they can do the big work.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about injury prevention. Why did we save this for last?
Because we talked about the risk factors, and now we're going to add some applicable stuff for you.
Oh, I like that.
So, like Sandra said, you want to strengthen the kinetic chain. Throwing is a whole body activity. And when we say working on the kinetic chain, we also mean working on its mobility. There was actually a pretty good prospective study that found neck mobility could even increase the risk of elbow injury.
What do you mean by neck mobility?
So they looked at rotations and flexion, and the limited rotation and flexion increase the risk of sustaining an elbow injury.
How bizarre.
Exactly, but that just shows how important the kinetic chain is.
So actually, I would say that I learned a mulligan technique. Actually, you learned it with me. Actually, I don't know if you did.
I think you taught me.
Yeah, because we didn't take the
We haven't
neck
done the
one
upper yet.
Okay.
Yet.
So I learned a mulligan technique that helps with rotation of the neck, and I use it so often.
You love that one.
I use it. I use it so much, actually. And if you look at people's neck mobility, I find that a lot of people have rotation more to one. I mean, even I have rotation more to one side than the other in my neck. And so that's really interesting that it's connected to elbow injuries in what is this, overhead athletes?
Yes.
So now I have a reason beyond just working on someone's neck.
Absolutely.
That I can link it to I'm preventing elbow injury.
Exactly.
Look at that.
And there is evidence to show that prevention exercises that utilize whole body mobility, whole body strengthening can decrease elbow injury risk. But what I thought was very interesting kind of going through all this and looking at some of these programs, they really don't do a lot of wrist and finger flexion stuff. Like take the Throwers 10 program. Like everyone knows about the Throwers 10 program. It's, a really good, starting point for any prevention program, rehab program. It's very popular, used a lot. And the only thing that's really in there for the forearm is wrist flexion or wrist extension. And from the beginning of this episode, what did we talk a lot about?
Wait, before I answer that, I just have to say that maybe the Throwers 10 programs are using endurance of grip strength, because every time you're doing Throwers 10, you're holding the band and
that's not wrong.
Grip.
Yeah, that's not wrong.
So you're doing grip strength and you're doing it for a long time.
That's true. I didn't think of it that way. So I would say in the anatomy section, what did we really focus on?
The wrist flexors?
And the finger flexors, which aren't emphasized in a lot of these exercises. And there's some studies that are viewing that the flexor digitorum superficialis is the more important dynamic stabilizer, followed right behind the flexor carpi ulnaris. But when you look at these exercise programs, you're just doing a generalized, I'm doing wrist curls, which is going to do all the wrist flexors, which are important, but let's highlight these other muscles. Let's strengthen our finger flexion. So doing more gripping things, doing individual finger flexions. We've already learned that just the flexion of the index finger and the two middle fingers can create such a huge benefit to valgus stability. So working on that as well. Even working on ulnar deviations, like let's break it down to anatomical function. Flexor carpi ulnaris does ulnar deviation, so we can work on strengthening that as well. So I think that's one area where a lot of these prevention programs, they do a great job of identifying the upper extremity and, working on that shoulder strength, the scapular stability, all important for elbow protection. But then I would also say, let's not forget about the finger flexors, because that is where you're going to get a lot of protection for the UCL as well.
Is that our action item for the day?
I would say that's our action item for the day.
I was actually really excited when I looked at this outline and I you were talking so much about the protective mechanism of UCL, because when I was rehabbing a UCL, I was doing a lot of pronation and finger flexors and wrist flexors because I was reading about how those are protective. And so I just have to pat myself on the back.
Yep, you did it.
So I'm really excited that this was, it came full circle.
Yes, absolutely.
Also, it's really good for grip strength. Something that's not very applicable for the clinic.
What?
Rock climbing.
That's not wrong. That's not wrong. My forearms are usually dead by the time we're done.
But you know what is very applicable for the clinic?
Are we talking about our bonus content?
Oh, you read my mind.
Yes. So for our bonus content, we will be going over just some wrist flexor exercises that you can do. Still have to put it together, but it will be available.
If you guys want access to that bonus content, go ahead and go to the show notes. It will be on Precision AT's website.
Yes.
For purchase. And your purchase will also help support the show.
Yep, absolutely.
And then remember that this episode is available for free CEUs.
So if you didn't want to buy the bonus content or the outline, you can just go into the show notes and go to the link to take the course or course quiz. You're already taking the course, I guess, if you're listening.
And we appreciate you guys that Precision AT is jumping on board with us and partnering in this great endeavor. They are offering this for free. That's crazy. So
with all their hard work too.
So even though we would appreciate the support, I know that they would definitely appreciate the support.
Absolutely.
If you guys are interested in the references that Randy used for this episode, they are going to be on our website, obviously for free. You can, if you are looking for more stuff to read, you can go ahead and start at what, how many articles would you say used for this?
Between 15 and 20.
So we have about 15 to 20 references that Randy used. Those will be on our website. And then if you're not part of our Facebook group, go ahead and go down to look, another thing you can find in the show notes.
Facebook group.
So make sure you go over to facebook.com/group/AT Corner podcast, or just look in the search bar for AT Corner community. We'll do a question of the week. Do you know what that is yet?
Not yet. I don't know yet. It might be a surprise.
All right, surprise away. And every other episode is education or stories. This was obviously an education. So next week we're jumping back into our athletic training stories. And you got anything else to add, Randy?
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you for helping us showcase athletic training behind the tape. Bye.